Funding for this program was provided by Central and Northern Virginia Public Television, by a grant from the University of Virginia, and through the generous support of viewers like you.
Jefferson is probably the most symbolic figure in our history. He carries an awful lot of moral weight, and this is a terrible burden for any historical character to bear.
Jefferson's words and Jefferson's image as the proponent of individual rights and of equality for all was very important to the civil rights movement. In speeches that Martin Luther King and other major civil rights leaders made, in their writings, in their sermons, he was always present.
Monticello is a wonderful place to visit. It's a wonderful house. The cost of maintaining it was paid for not by Jefferson, but by his slaves.
Where has nature spread so rich a mantle under the eye? Mountains, forests, rocks, rivers. With what majesty do we there ride above the storms? How sublime to look down into the workhouse of nature, to see her clouds, hail, snow, rain, thunder, all fabricated at our feet. And the glorious sun, when rising as if out of a distant water, just gilding the tops of the mountains and giving life to all nature. Thomas Jefferson.
Each morning from his mountaintop home, Thomas Jefferson could look out in awe at the wonders and workings of nature. For Jefferson, the natural world is his classroom, and he its most admiring student. The beauty, order, and balance that nature reveals also serves to guide Jefferson to his beliefs about human nature. As a boy, Jefferson walked these hills he later inherits from his father. Here he builds the home of his dreams and calls it Monticello. With its styles of ancient and modern Europe, Monticello shines against the rugged Virginia wilderness. Over 4 decades, Jefferson designs and redesigns Monticello as he shapes and reshapes a new nation. Both stand as creative endeavors of a most creative mind and as lasting reflections of one of America's great Renaissance men. A biographer writes of Jefferson, he could calculate an eclipse, survey an estate, tie an artery, plan an edifice, try a cause, break a horse, dance a minuet, and play a violin.
Thomas Jefferson is one of the most fascinating and complex figures to ever come on the American landscape. His ideas about individual rights, education, freedom of religion, and freedom from the oppressions of our own government have made him more than an important figure in our national mythology. To many, Jefferson has become a symbol of all that we value in America. So it remains one of the great ironies in our history that the man who writes the Declaration of Independence, declaring the equality of all men and their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, writes these immortal words while holding scores of African Americans as slaves.
Jefferson certainly is a man of his day, a day when the institution of slavery is already deeply entrenched in the American colonies. In fact, Jefferson's own wealth, his social status, and his political influence in some ways depend on slavery.
But in so many other ways, Jefferson is not a man confined to his day, especially when speaking about personal liberties. Jefferson lives to be 83, twice the normal life expectancy of the time. His life spans a period in history when America is radically rethinking its notions about race and slavery. And Jefferson's own words have enormous impact, both good and bad. Sometimes those things that are supposed to be self-evident can be the hardest to understand.
I'm reminded of a statement by James Parton about 100 or a little over 100 years ago. Parton was our first professional biographer, and I think he put his finger on what Jefferson had become even to his time, 1874. He said, if Jefferson is wrong, America is wrong. If Jefferson is right, America is right. That kind of moral identification has continued into our own time and is the source, I think, of much of the controversy that surrounds Jefferson. When Jefferson does something or behaves in an ignoble fashion, then it's as if America itself was behaving in an ignoble way.
I was, as a naive kid in the ghettos of Houston, Texas, and in about 6th grade, 7th grade, whenever you get to the Declaration of Independence, I thought it sounded just great. And I would write speeches about what this country promised, and all men, and we weren't sensitive about it being all men back when I was a kid, and I thought that those words really gave America the kind of promise and opportunity which would free me as an individual to soar as high, as far, as wide as I chose.
Our ideas about race come from comparing what we are with the standard Thomas Jefferson set for us. And the standard he set for us is an ideal that all are created equal. And if we look at race relations today, and we clearly see that all are not treated equal, all are not respected as if endowed by their creator with certain rights, and all don't have certain rights and aren't allowed to practice the same kinds of rights. And so we contrast that experience with this ideal, and we find ourselves wanting. So in that sense, yes, our racial discussion derives precisely from Thomas Jefferson and owes itself precisely to Thomas Jefferson, because the Thomas Jefferson that's most important to me is the one who wrote those words.
Jefferson is always referred to for his hope, but behind that hope was a persistent worry, which we all share, which I think drives much of this debate over Jefferson. It's worrying that somehow that seed of evil that was planted with slavery there at the very beginning of the American nation is still going to be what kills us.
I dreamed I knocked at heaven's door, but nobody was there. I dreamed I knocked at heaven's door, but nobody was there. And my little baby cries, does the Lord answer our prayers?
The first African slaves in an English colony, a group of about 20, arrive in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 aboard a Dutch man of war. By 1750, some 10 million Africans have been taken in chains to the Western Hemisphere, with 400,000 coming to the American colonies.
It was not clear at all for decades that African slavery was going to be the main economic institution of Virginia. For a long time, slavery coexisted with indentured servitude, and if you had asked leading Virginians which they would have preferred, They would have said, if we could have this be a white man's country, if we could have enough English men and women come here willing to work hard for 7 years, that would be the way that we would like to go. But they're not coming, and the ones who do come are dying quickly. If we're going to be able to have the kind of plantations that we came here to establish in the first place, we're going to have labor. And where is that labor available from? It's from these ships that are bringing slaves from Africa and from the Caribbean. So the process takes a very long time to congeal.
Slavery is legal in the northern colonies for much of the 17th and 18th centuries, but it is not as critical as in the South because the growing season is shorter. In the South, slave labor is thought to be essential to plantation life. Yet many plantation owners still complain about how unproductive slave labor is.
And one reason that the sharp distinction between North and South didn't exist is that slavery didn't seem to be an institution with much of a future. It seemed to obviously have made many men in Virginia rich. It had been here for 120, 130 years by the time Jefferson's born. But there's a widespread sense that this is not the wave of the future.
Thomas Jefferson is born in 1743 on the edge of the Virginia frontier on a plantation known as Shadwell. He is the third child and the first son of Peter and Jane Jefferson. His mother, born in England, is from a well-to-do family. His father is a native Virginian of modest means with little formal education. Yet Peter Jefferson would become a successful farmer and surveyor, two skills he teaches his son.
Even from his earliest days, African Americans are part of Jefferson's life on the plantation. One in particular is a slave named Jupiter.
He was born in the same year as Jefferson, and Jefferson's own brother was very much younger than he was, and we can begin to speculate that Jupiter perhaps might have been a boyhood companion at Shadwell when Jefferson was growing up. He became Jefferson's personal servant, accompanied him to Williamsburg. Jefferson would give him large sums of money to go out into town and buy things. He was a very trusted servant.
As a young man, Jefferson began reading classics early. He had two schoolmasters in what would have amounted to grammar school instruction, but they were tutors, who introduced him to Latin and Greek. He was always a very conscientious young man as well as an older man. He, according to people who knew him, spent 14 and 15 hours a day at study. So he immersed himself very rapidly in the classical languages. Even as a teenager, began to draw from Cicero, from Seneca, from Epicurus, from other classical authors.
The Greek philosopher Epicurus writes, "It is not possible to live pleasantly without living prudently, honorably, and justly." From the Stoics, Seneca, and Epictetus, Jefferson learns that the highest good for any creature consists in acting in accordance with its nature. From these classic philosophers, Jefferson begins to shape a direction for his life. At 17, Jefferson attends the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, after which he takes up the study of law. His mentor is the brilliant George Wythe. In years to come, Wythe is a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a harsh critic of slavery.
At the age of 21, Jefferson inherits the family estate after the death of his father. The inheritance includes 5,000 acres of land and 22 slaves. He is now part of Virginia's landed gentry, and in 1768, at the age of 25, Thomas Jefferson is elected to Virginia's governing body, the House of Burgesses. At this time, Virginia law makes it difficult for slave owners to free their slaves. Freed slaves are a challenge to the institution, but at the same time, the law prevents masters from abandoning those slaves who were too old or too sick to work.
In his first session in the House, Jefferson proposes changes in the slavery laws. He joins with Colonel Richard Bland, who Jefferson describes as an older and respected member of the House. Their proposal extends protection for slaves and allows limited manumission.
I seconded Bland's motion, and as a younger member was more spared in the debate, but he was denounced as an enemy of his country and was treated with the grossest indecorum. Thomas Jefferson.
The bill is soundly defeated. For the young Jefferson, the defeat is humiliating and one he long remembers. Yet Jefferson had now distinguished himself from many other plantation owners by identifying slavery as an institution in need of change.
The whole commerce between master and slave is the perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever.
Jefferson is convinced that slavery is an evil that someday will end. Yet he also believes that when freed, blacks must be colonized in Africa or the Caribbean, where they can live as free and independent people, but not in America. For Jefferson, the history of abuse and suffering is far too great for freed blacks and whites to ever live together.
Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race. Thomas Jefferson.
Mr. Jefferson was a tall, straight-bodied man as ever you see, right square-shouldered. Ne'er a man in this town walked so straight as old Master. Neither built man as ever was seen in Virginia, I reckon, or any place. A straight-up man, long face, high nose. Mr. Jefferson always singing when riding or walking. Hardly seen him anywhere outdoors, but he wasn't singing. He had a fine, clear voice, sung minuets and such, fiddled in the parlor. Isaac Jefferson.
Isaac Jefferson is a blacksmith at Monticello. He can neither read nor write, but years after Thomas Jefferson's death, Isaac dictates his memoirs about life on the mountain. Like many slaves living on plantations, Isaac assumes the family name of his owner.
There were really two very obvious worlds at Monticello, the world of Jefferson and his family and the world of his slaves, the African-American men, women, and children who lived on the 5,000-acre plantation. Jefferson referred to everyone who lived on the plantation as his family. He spoke of my family of 127 souls, and by doing that, he's using the word family in a sense that's obsolete today, meaning an entire household with Jefferson at the head of that household, or in his case, plantation.
On New Year's Day, 1772, Thomas Jefferson marries the 23-year-old widow, Martha Wales Skelton. No painting of Martha survives, although some believe this to be her silhouette. She is described as petite, vivacious, a model of grace. And she shares her husband's love for music. She plays the harpsichord. He plays the violin.
Two years after they marry, Jefferson's father-in-law, John Wales, dies. Jefferson inherits 11,000 acres of land and 135 slaves from the estate. Jefferson, who expresses so much distaste for the institution of slavery, has now, through inheritance, become the second largest slaveholder in the county. But in addition to the land and the slaves, Jefferson also inherits from his father-in-law a rather sizable debt. Most Virginia planters, like John Wales, owe money to British creditors. By accepting the property as inheritance, Jefferson must also assume the debt. But it is 1774, Jefferson is in good financial shape and confident he can eliminate the debt in short order.
This, of course, was a miscalculation, a staggering miscalculation, but how could Jefferson have anticipated the American Revolution, the revolution that both makes him famous, creates the great world historical opportunity for him to be a great revolutionary leader, but also, in a way, inflicts the burden of debt on Jefferson throughout his life.
Finding it necessary to sell a few more slaves to accomplish the debt of Mr. Wales to Farrell and Jones, I have thought of disposing of Dinah and her family. As her husband lives with you, I should choose to sell her in your neighborhood so as to unite her with him. Thomas Jefferson.
Mr. Jefferson was very particular in the transaction of all of his business. He kept an account of everything. Nothing was too small for him to keep an account of. He knew exactly how much of everything was raised at each plantation, what became of it, and how much was sold and how much was fed out. Edmund Bacon.
For 16 years, the overseer at Monticello is Edmund Bacon. Jefferson describes Bacon as an honest, correct man in his conduct, who possesses the esteem, confidence, and goodwill of his neighbors. On most large plantations, the overseer directs the work of the slaves, allowing plantation owners, like Jefferson, to keep some distance.
The slaves really each year had potluck about what kind of overseer would be in charge of them, and some of them were known to be very cruel. So even though Jefferson constantly expressed his wish that his slaves be treated humanely and that the use of the whip be reduced to a minimum, we do know that there was cruelty and physical punishment on the plantation. I think Jefferson, when dealing with his slaves on a one-to-one basis, was very sympathetic, merciful. He acted as a human being in his relationship with them in that way. But he was also the head of an economic enterprise, the 5,000-acre plantation, and so he had to act as a manager of labor, also an owner of valuable property. And these two impulses were in constant collision, I think, in the course of his life.
Yet what the slaves enabled Jefferson to do is develop his great love of farming. The small landholders are the most precious part of a state, he writes. He experiments with methods of crop rotation to increase productivity. He devises detailed plans for seeding and harvesting fruits and vegetables. He invents the mold board for a plow as a better way to till the soil. He decides not to patent it, saying, its contribution to the American farmer is too important to gain profit.
Jefferson had an almost religious sense of the land and the importance of people being independent. He was philosophically opposed to any kind of oppression. He wanted individuals to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and all of this translated in his time into the notion that a person would own a certain amount of land and that he would work that land, and by the sweat of his own brow, he would have a certain self-sufficiency and would not be dependent on others, or certainly not on the government.
Yet, in many ways, Jefferson is dependent on the help of his slaves. Over his lifetime, he owns an estimated 400 slaves. They work mostly as house servants, skilled craftsmen, and field hands. For more than 50 years, Jefferson keeps records of his slave family in his farm book. He records their births and deaths, lists the provisions they received, calculates to the finest detail their productivity, and even notes their smallpox inoculations. Jefferson has little use for doctors, so he insists on doing the inoculations himself. One of the slave families Jefferson inherits from his father-in-law soon changes Monticello. It is the Hemmings family. The Hemmings are experienced house servants and skilled artisans who take on privileged status in the Jefferson home. John Hemmings, who can read and write, becomes a skilled carpenter, producing many fine wood pieces. James Hemmings becomes the principal cook at Monticello. Later, he accompanies Jefferson to France to learn the art of French cooking. Robert Hemmings replaces Jefferson's boyhood companion, Jupiter, as Jefferson's personal valet. And Betty Hemmings heads the household staff. Over the years, Jefferson owns 30 of Betty Hemmings's children and grandchildren.
Jefferson must have thought highly of her because he gave her a plot of land. She had chickens of her own. She had her own eggs, and he bought them from her. So he must have thought very highly of her. She sort of was the matriarch of all of the house slaves there, as long as she was able to do that. So she must have been a pretty intelligent, most likely, most likable person.
While the Hemmings family enjoys privileged status at Monticello, most slaves spend the day working the fields, raising wheat, corn, and tobacco.
All ages would be in the field. Mother, father, sister, brother, uncle, aunt, grandma, everybody would be in the field. And just doing whatever it took to work tobacco. That's hoeing, that's worming, that's suckering, that's hard work. Sun up to sundown 6 days a week. And because it was difficult work, you had to find a way to break that monotony of that workday. And the way they did that was through music. Music in the form of a work song, where you had a caller and you had a response. The baby they crying, rolling on the boat, child. The baby they crying, rolling on the boat, child. The baby they crying, rolling on the boat, child. Rolling on the boat, child, wanna go home. But the real party started Saturday night. Because on Saturday night, they had something called a Saturday night gathering, where they play music and dance and sing and tell stories and just get together. This is when the African American community was a distinct community. This is when, if you look at what they did on Saturday night and Sunday, you can really begin to see that these people are not slaves, that this is a culture of people that were enslaved.
Every sense of beauty that he had, he tried to fulfill it in his image of Monticello. I don't think there's another person in American history, and certainly no president, where geographical site, place, and particularly building is as much a part of one's identity. So intrinsically a part of the identity of the person. In the case of Jefferson, unlike almost any other president, I say you can't know Jefferson until you come to Monticello.
What Monticello reveals about Jefferson is the precision of his mind and the passions of his life, the balance of the head and heart. He designs the parlor after the salons of France. Here, Jefferson entertains an endless parade of notable friends and guests, surrounded by his favorite works of art. The entranceway is a showcase for natural history. Antlers from the journeys of Lewis and Clark. Mastodon bones. Jefferson believes no animal created in nature can ever become extinct. A giant deer skin tells the story of a battle between the Sioux and Mandan Indian tribes. From his earliest years, Jefferson looks with admiration on Native Americans. Jefferson's private library and study are his inner sanctum. He reads in 7 languages, including Greek and Latin. and prefers to read a work in its original form, so nothing can be lost in translation. Here in his cabinet, Jefferson spends hours in study, exchanging correspondence with the great minds of his day. The polygraph creates duplicate copies of his letters. During his lifetime, Jefferson writes more than 18,000.
Jefferson was nothing if not methodical. He liked to brag that he rose with the sun, and somebody said, well, how do you know when the sun's up? He said, when I can read the hands on the clock on the ledge at the foot of my bed. And there it was, facing him. It seems madness, but in another way, it's a good metaphor for his life because he calibrated his day just that precisely. His grandson said he was a miser with his time. He was nothing if not purposeful and organized. He wanted every minute to count for something constructive.
When Jefferson's oldest daughter, Martha, is 11, she goes away to school. He writes to her prescribing a schedule for her day. With respect to the distribution of your time, the following is what I should approve. From 8 to 10 o'clock, practice music. From 10 to 1, dance one day and draw the other. From 1 to 2, draw on the day you dance and write a letter the next day. From 3 to 4, read French. From 4 to 5, exercise yourself in music. From 5 until bedtime, read English, write, etc. I expect you will write me by every post. Take care you never spell a word wrong. P.S. Keep my letters and read them at times that you may always have present in your mind those things which will endear you to me.
Jefferson took a very active role in the education of both his daughters and his grandchildren. He engaged directly in their education himself. And evidence is a little scanty about what he thought was appropriate for his slaves. There really is no evidence that he felt they should be educated in any way, and in fact, what does survive suggests that he thought slaves should not be educated. They first should be taught habits of industry and how to survive. But quite a number of Monticello slaves could at least read, and many could read and write. And there's a wonderful letter from the slave house servant at Poplar Forest to Jefferson, sending her greetings.
Master, I write you a few lines to let you know that your house and furniture are all safe, as I expect you will be glad to know. I heard that you did not expect to come up this fall. I was sorry to hear that you were so unwell you could not come. It grieves me many times. But I hope, as you have been so blessed in this life, that you consider it was God that done it and no other one. We all ought to be thankful for what he has done for us. We ought to serve and obey his commandments, that you may set to win the prize and after glory run. Master, I do not believe my ignorant letter will be much encouragement to you, as you know I'm a poor, ignorant creature. This leaves us all well. Adieu. I am your humble servant, Hannah.
While his slaves do the bulk of the manual labor on the plantation, Jefferson spends much of his day in the endless pursuit of knowledge.
Old Master had abundance of books. Sometimes we'd have 20 of them down on the floor at once. Read first one, then the other. Isaac has often wondered how Old Master came to have such a mighty head, read so many of them books. And when they go to ask him anything, he go right straight to the book and tell you all about it. Isaac Jefferson.
Jefferson emerges as a major American figure in an international community of intellectuals known as the Enlightenment. Science had only recently discovered things like gravity, electricity, magnetism, and energy. And out of these discoveries, universal laws about nature and the natural order were unfolding. Now, enlightened thinkers reasoned that if there was a natural order to the things they could see around them, there must be a natural order to man as well. Nature now became a tool to their utopian dreams of universal peace and equality.
Jefferson most admires three Englishmen. Francis Bacon, who believed that man could decipher the simple, basic structures of nature. The scientist Isaac Newton, who attempted to explain the mechanical laws of the physical universe. And philosopher John Locke, who argued against the divine right of kings. Nearly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, Locke wrote that all men are free and equal in the state of nature and possess certain natural rights. But another important influence on Jefferson is a Presbyterian minister, Francis Hutcheson, a leader of the Scottish Enlightenment. Hutcheson claimed that a person's highest faculty is the moral sense.
This sense of right and wrong, of benevolence to others, of matters of the heart, is part of our nature and equal in all human beings. For Jefferson, this moral sense makes us accountable to ourselves and each other, and it makes possible the right to self-government. This similarity in the moral sense also makes all other physical and mental differences minor.
Jefferson immerses himself hour after hour in this world of knowledge. From his mountaintop home, he fashions an outlook that is a fusion of ideas from philosophy, science, law, and history. It is from this base of study and his own family experience that Jefferson's ideas about race and slavery emerge.
We know that among the Romans, about the Augustan age especially, the condition of their slaves was much more deplorable than that of the blacks on the continent of America. Yet among the Romans, their slaves were often their rarest artists. They excelled too in science, insomuch as to be usually employed as tutors to their masters' children. Epictetus, Terence, and Phaedrus were slaves, but they were of the race of whites. It is not their condition then, but nature, which has produced the distinction. Thomas Jefferson.
These words come from Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. Written by him in longhand, it is the only book Jefferson ever publishes. Notes is not intended as a book on race and slavery, but Jefferson's response to many of the false notions about the New World being advanced by European naturalists, including France's celebrated George Louis Leclerc Buffon. Buffon claims America is a land only recently emerged from the deluge, a damp, humid place where animals and people are smaller than normal. He calls it a land best suited for insects, reptiles, and feeble men. To defend the New World before an enlightened Europe, Jefferson dispatches observers across the countryside to measure and collect data on everything from the smallest creatures to the natural wonders. In Notes, Jefferson describes in detail the rivers, mountains, climate, abundant minerals, and native Indian populations. Blacks are also part of his study of the New World, and in Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson becomes one of the first Americans to put in print ideas about racial differences. About blacks, he writes,
comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous.
In Notes, Jefferson uses his studies of science to draw conclusions about blacks, including how their blood is darker than whites and how they secrete fluids differently than whites. All these conclusions, he says, are tentative, in need of further scientific observations. Jefferson stresses that he is merely the observer of the differences that nature, not he, has determined.
Jefferson saw a world around him warped, he thought, by tyranny and ignorance and superstition. But it was a powerful world, and it was the only world that people had seen. It had produced great cathedrals and great mansions and palaces, and so everywhere there was the presence of institutional power over people's lives that dwarfed ordinary people. And he very much wanted to dismantle these symbols and this reality of power over people. Now, the greatest weapon he could use was to say that it was unnatural, that nature had a better plan than this artificial one that kings and churches had created. So in order to use nature as a weapon against the artifices of the past, he emphasized uniformities and similarities, that all men are alike, all men are equal. What it meant is if there were people who were conspicuously different, like African Americans or Native Americans or women, he assumed that nature had sort of pushed them outside this new liberal natural order. And at the time, it enabled him to combat privilege and status, inherited forms, but it did create a new way to discriminate. Jefferson was very intolerant of living with diversity.
Jefferson concludes with some reservations that in matters of the head, blacks are inferior to whites. But for Jefferson, there is the other dimension, the moral sense, the matters of the heart.
Whether further observation will or will not verify the conjecture that nature has been less bountiful to them in the endowments of the head, I believe that in those of the heart, she will be found to have done them justice.
Jefferson is reluctant to have notes on the state of Virginia widely distributed because he fears it may hurt the chances for future emancipation. Yet the work becomes widely known, and Jefferson finds himself defending his remarks for the rest of his life.
Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I have myself entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to Negroes by nature, and to find that in this respect they are on a par with ourselves. My doubts were the result of personal observation on the limited sphere of my own state, where the opportunities for the development of their genius were not favorable, and those of exercising it still less so. I expressed them, therefore, with great hesitation, but whatever be their degree of talent, it is no measure of their rights. Thomas Jefferson.
The Boston Massacre, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill. Blood is spilling, and the colonials are rapidly being brought to the brink of war against the most powerful nation on earth. In Philadelphia, delegates gather to decide the fate of the colonies.
One of the curiosities of the American Revolution is that the leaders talk about equality and liberty, and yet the leaders are in fact not the equal folks. They are, in a sense, aristocrats.
Many of the delegates to the Second Continental Congress are slaveholders. At this time, slavery is still legal in every colony, north and south. The Virginia delegation, including a 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson, makes the initial proposal of independence. The Congress appoints a committee of 5 to write the Declaration. The committee includes Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson is asked to write the draft. During the 3rd week of June, the readings and studies of Jefferson's young life enable him to turn a revolution into a struggle for all humanity.
Entitled by the laws of nature and of nature's God, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
In Locke's second treatise on civil government, which is the locus classicus, you might say, of the theory of the natural rights and the Declaration of Independence, Locke defined the inalienable rights of man as life, liberty, and property. Jefferson substituted for property the pursuit of happiness. Property was a civil right, not a natural right. Underneath, in his own mind, he could not say anything that would give a status of an inalienable right to the ownership of slaves, to the ownership of other men, of human chattels. I think that this was sort of in the back of his mind, that that would just be unconscionable, and that could not be done. So he excluded any such possibility by dropping property from the trinity of human right, inalienable rights, and by doing something very revolutionary by declaring life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the inalienable rights of man.
Jefferson identifies with his slaves and with all slaves in his concern about the loss of freedom, the loss of independence, the loss of self-mastery. This is what the Revolution meant for Jefferson and his colleagues, and that is, if the British triumphed, then freedom would be lost. And Jefferson could see himself in the condition of his slaves. This may seem far-fetched or exaggerated to us, but it's the principle of the thing that matters to Jefferson. And that is that if you don't control yourself, you are a slave. And in this sense, it's a perverse and ironic one. You can say that Jefferson does see the equality of all people. And that is, he acknowledges that losing their freedom, privileged whites such as himself could become like the slaves they held in bondage.
Jefferson and other men of his times who had an intellectual bent were very aware of the history of the institution of slavery, the classical tradition, the history of the idea of slavery in Western civilization, the idea of freedom in Western civilization. And they were very aware that in every society there had always been at bottom a group of people who were not included in the body politic, that there was nothing inconsistent about standing for freedom and equality for those who were part of the citizenry, the body politic by definition, and having a class which did the work that was below the manual labor and all the rest of it, on which this class, this upper class, stood. And in their minds, this did not seem inconsistent. It would not have seemed inconsistent. So it makes sense that when Jefferson said, you know, all men are created equal, he didn't mean slaves.
Exactly what Jefferson meant when he said all men are created equal is not easily answered. He certainly meant more than all people are equal before the law. He meant much more than that. In some basic sense, he believed that all people were created equal. Now, in his particular case, he simply could not accept the equality of blacks. He could accept the equality of Indians. He felt that they were deprived, but that it was simply a question of environment, and that if you changed their environment and educated them, they could be made civilized, is the way he would have put it. But when it came to blacks, he simply was blind to this. He was unable to fulfill his own rhetoric, his own language.
That phrase, all men are created equal, we'll always be tantalized with it. I think Jefferson knew exactly what he meant, and I think his contemporaries knew what he meant. It was a well-established principle in moral theory that before government, in a state of nature, all people are born equally free and independent. That is, they're not under the jurisdiction of anyone else. They are not born with any disabilities, are born with special privileges. That's what equality means. I think that was clear to Jefferson. I think it was clear to him and everyone else that it applied to all people. From the perspective of all men are created equal, blacks are created equal. If they are enslaved, it's an example of tyranny imposed upon them because they're denied their natural equality. That's totally apart from equality of abilities or any other issues of an empirical sort. Jefferson speculated broadly and not always consistently about the inferiority of blacks, but none of this speculation about blacks had a thing in the world to do with human equality as expressed in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence.
But in addition to the preamble, Jefferson's original draft lists the grievances against the king. The last grievance attacks the king for controlling the American slave trade and for encouraging slaves to arm against the colonies.
It's a very powerful indictment, and he says that that trade is a war against human nature itself. And he goes on to describe the horrors of that war and goes on to point out that the slaves are men, M-E-N in capital letters.
The Declaration's relationship to slavery is full of myths, of a whole variety of them. One of them is that Jefferson tried to end slavery or attack slavery in the Declaration. This is simply not the case. What Jefferson proposed was an attack on King George for encouraging the African slave trade. There was a certain amount of truth to Jefferson's attack. Virginia, for example, had tried to prohibit the African slave trade in the 1770s, and King George's council had overruled the Virginia legislature and prohibited Virginia from banning the trade. But Virginia wasn't banning the slave trade because they wanted to ban slavery. They were banning the slave trade for economic reasons. Too much money was flowing back to England, or back to at least slave traders. And for prudential reasons. They were afraid of all these Africans coming over. The Africans were more likely to revolt, they believed, than African Americans who were born in the country. And they may, at the moment, have had too many slaves anyways. There was kind of a surplus of slaves. There were lots of reasons for opposing the African slave trade. Some of them humanitarian. It was simply an awful, awful, horrible thing. And so one could say we shouldn't be this horrible. We shouldn't chain people up in the bottom of ships. But once we have them here, that's something else again. So Jefferson's attack is on the slave trade. It's not on slavery itself.
After much debate, Congress approves the phrase, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us," as the only reference to the king's control over slavery.
The clause reprobating the enslaving of the inhabitants of Africa was struck out in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under those censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. Thomas Jefferson.
In the early evening of July 4th, Congress accepts Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. People celebrate as the Declaration is read in cities and towns across the colonies. Crowds tear down the statue of King George. Across the Atlantic, the Declaration prompts the English writer Samuel Johnson to ask, "How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" In the hopes of a quick end to the rebellion, Virginia's Lord Dunmore offers slaves their freedom in exchange for service to the British Crown. 800 slaves join. Across the colonies, some 60,000 slaves run away from their masters to join the British. In the first years of the Revolution, the Continental Army excludes blacks. But when enlistment quotas fall short, the policy changes. Slave owners are offered the enlistment fee for slaves that fight in the cause of independence. As many as 8,000 free or enslaved blacks join. But Jefferson's slaves are not among them. During the Revolution, Jefferson serves in the Virginia legislature and later as governor. He succeeds in passing a bill banning the further importation of slaves into Virginia. But he refuses to support a bill that allows slaveholders to free their slaves. That will pass later without the support of Jefferson. At the end of Jefferson's term as governor, the British, sweeping through Virginia, take Monticello and the surrounding plantation. Jefferson narrowly escapes. 30 of Jefferson's slaves are taken by the British. By 1781, the once hopeless Continental Army now has the British on the run. With France as its ally, the colonials corner the British in Yorktown, Virginia, and in October, the British surrender. The struggle for American independence is over.
A slave was better off ending up behind Cornwallis's lines or behind British lines at the end of the war than ending up behind American lines at the end of the war. None of the slaves that were returned to Jefferson after the war ended up as free people. They lived and died as slaves. From the slaves' perspective, indeed, they might have been better off if the Americans had lost the war.
We on the hill will be free someday. We on the hill will be free someday. We on the hill will be free someday. When we're free, feel our spirit on the hill.
What an incomprehensible machine is man, who can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, and death itself in vindication of his own liberty, and the next moment be deaf to all those motives whose power supported him through his trial, and inflict on his fellow men a bondage, 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than ages of that which he rose in rebellion to oppose. But we must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that that is preparing the deliverance of these, our suffering brethren, when the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in darkness. Doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress. Thomas Jefferson.
The revolution that won America's independence has taken a toll on the land. Years of poor harvests have increased the debt for many farmers. At Monticello, like most Virginia planters, Thomas Jefferson and his wife Martha now face years of rebuilding. Some plantation owners used the war as an excuse to erase their debt to British creditors. Jefferson is not one of them.
Jefferson didn't look for political solutions to his problem of indebtedness. A debt was a debt, and he was a man of his word. And you have to think of Jefferson as being extremely conscious of the importance of words authentically spoken. That's what the Declaration of Independence is all about. If words don't matter, if we can redefine them and reinterpret them, then this declaration is nonsense. It doesn't stand for anything. And this is a central principle of Jefferson's political life, to be true to his words and to be true to his debts.
For Jefferson, the issues of slavery and indebtedness are connected. If he frees his slaves, work on the plantation stops, and he defaults on the debt. If he sells the slaves to raise the capital and pay off the debt, the plantation suffers, and the slaves remain slaves, only to someone else. Jefferson always believes his slaves are best treated under his care. Owning slaves makes Jefferson part of the privileged class. It provides him with the opportunity for a lifestyle he's grown accustomed to. Yet his views on the institution remain the same. Slavery is unjust, an unpleasant part of America's inheritance from Britain. But for Jefferson, the conditions are not yet right for change.
The center of domestic life at Monticello is Jefferson's wife, Martha. In 10 years of marriage, they have 6 children, but only 2 daughters, Martha and Maria, survive childhood. After giving birth to their 6th child, Jefferson's wife, Martha, becomes ill. She will never recover. As she is dying, she is attended by Jefferson, their daughter Martha, and servants Betty Hemings and a young Sally Hemings. Jefferson cares for his wife with a love their oldest daughter Martha never forgets.
As a nurse, no female ever had more tenderness or anxiety. He nursed my poor mother, sitting up with her and administering her medicines and drink to the last. For 4 months that she lingered, he was never out of calling.
The plantation overseer remembers the final scene.
She told him she could not die happy if she thought her 4 children were ever to have a stepmother brought in over them. Holding her other hand in his, Mr. Jefferson promised her solemnly that he would never marry again. And he never did. Edmund Bacon.
On her deathbed, Martha writes to her husband from Lawrence Stern's novel, Tristram Shandy.
Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace lets me wish what rapidity life follows my pen. The days and hours of it are flying over our heads like clouds of windy day, never to return. More, everything presses on.
She is too weak to finish it herself, so Jefferson writes the rest.
And every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it are preludes to that eternal separation, which we are shortly to make.
Jefferson keeps their note for the rest of his life. No painting of Martha, nor any of their correspondence survives. It is believed in his grief, Jefferson destroys everything.
Before that event, my scheme of life had been determined. I had folded myself in the arms of retirement and rested all prospects of future happiness on domestic and literary objects. A single event wiped away all my plans and left me a blank which I had not the spirits to fill up. Thomas Jefferson.
There are slaves in all of the 13 states in 1776 when they declare independence. By the end of the Revolution, Massachusetts and New Hampshire have outright abolished slavery. Massachusetts declares slavery to be ended because the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 uses language almost identical to the Declaration of Independence, declaring all men are born free and equal. Therefore, there can't be slaves if you're born free and equal. Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have passed gradual emancipation statutes, which means that the children of all slaves will be born free, and as the existing slaves die, the institution of slavery will die out. By 1804, New Jersey has become the last northern state, New York in 1799, to also adopt these gradual emancipation statutes. So the North creates itself.
The American Revolution created the anti-slave consciousness, in a sense. For 100 years, slavery had existed in the colonies without substantial criticism. From the late 17th century to the middle of the 18th century, there's very little criticism. Once in a while, a Quaker, a few isolated individuals, but by and large, slavery was accepted as a given. But suddenly, in the middle of the 18th century, coincident with the rising sense of Enlightenment values, particularly freedom, independence, slavery becomes a problem. People suddenly say, well, this is inconsistent. And from that moment on, and it coincides with the American Revolution, slavery's on the defensive. And it's only then that you begin to get racial defenses of slavery. Nobody used race as an excuse or a justification for slavery earlier, because they didn't have to.
So while Jefferson's words about equality in the Declaration provide a spark for emancipation in the North, ironically, it is also Jefferson's words, this time in Notes on the State of Virginia, that express the feeling of many slaveholders.
Whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color, and perhaps of faculty, is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson finds himself between two worlds moving on a collision course. He condemns the evils of slavery, but he doesn't free his own slaves. Yet in Notes on the State of Virginia, he details a plan for emancipation on the condition that when freed, blacks must be colonized in Africa or the Caribbean, where they can live as free people. To that end, Jefferson proposes educating blacks now at the public expense. These ideas anger many slaveholders who have no interest in educating their slaves only to lose them. But colonizing blacks is crucial to Jefferson because he believes the history of pain and suffering makes it impossible for blacks and whites to live together in freedom.
What Jefferson was reflecting, again, was the confusion and the search for solutions to a sort of impossible situation that had been created, which he perceived as being impossible in a sense. Painful, a situation that if it had not existed, it would have been better, might be the way he would put it. It would have been better if we hadn't, created this situation, but it has happened. It has its benefits, it has its liabilities. I don't see how we, after all that's happened, could live together. Well, some of the time he's been right, because there have been some very painful eras in our history when it seemed as if we couldn't live together. So that was an appropriate question for him to ask, and in the context of his own times, a solution that made sense to him and a lot of other people.
In the years after the Revolution, settlers are moving west in greater numbers. What they discover is an America blessed beyond dreams, with abundant game and fertile soil. But as people move into the Promised Land, they bring with them the question, will this be slave territory or will it be free? Jefferson details a plan.
In 1784, when Jefferson was a delegate from Virginia to the Confederation Congress, he introduced a bill to organize what became the Northwest Territory. This particular bill sought to describe the terms under which the territory, roughly from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, was going to be organized into states. Jefferson presented a plan that divided it up into 15 different states, described how the territory would be converted into a state, and in Article 6 said that slavery would be banned from this territory as of the year 1800.
Unfortunately, that provision was eliminated from the ordinance of 1784, the first plan of government for the Western Territory. One vote. And he said that so the future of a whole race was hanging on that one vote, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. The reason that one vote was not cast because the congressman was ill in his lodgings and could not be on the floor. So he felt that that was a terribly tragic circumstance. The same provision, however, for the restriction of slavery in the Western Territories was included in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which, however, applied only to the territories north of the Ohio River to the Great Lakes.
And the compromise they reached was that they cut off the line at the Ohio River. The area north of the Ohio River was set aside for free soil, and they didn't say anything about the area south of it. They passed another ordinance called the Southwest Ordinance, which didn't have Article 6, and so slavery was allowed. And that's how you end up with slavery in the areas of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. The fact is that if the country had gone forward with what Jefferson proposed, which was to say that as of 1800, all slavery must end in this area, what you're talking about is something that certainly might have eliminated the American Civil War, because all of the slave states west of the Appalachian Mountains would have been free states.
In March 1785, Jefferson is appointed minister to France, succeeding Benjamin Franklin. For Jefferson, it is a time of rebirth. The architecture, the music, the salons ignite his imagination. But one thing that disturbs him is that French women have notions about politics, and they're willing to express them. For Jefferson, this is unnatural. While in France, Jefferson is introduced to a London artist, Maria Causeway. She is petite, with golden curls and deep blue eyes. And she is the wife of painter Richard Causeway. Jefferson is mesmerized by her, and for months they are constant companions. But the relationship is short-lived, for soon after, she returns to England with her husband. Jefferson is compelled to write her. He models his letter after another work by Lawrence Stern, Sentimental Journey. More than a goodbye, it reveals Jefferson's inner struggle between reason and passion, his head and heart.
Head. These are the eternal consequences of your warmth and precipitation. This is one of the scrapes into which you are ever leading us. Heart. Oh, my friend, this is no moment to upbraid my foibles. I am rent into fragments by the force of my grief. Head. The art of life is the art of avoiding pain. Everything in this world is a matter of calculation. Advance then with caution the balance in your hand. Put into one scale the pleasures which any object may offer, but put fairly into the other the pains which are to follow. The most effectual means of being secure against pain is to retire within ourselves and to suffice for our own happiness. Heart. But let us now try the virtues of your mathematical balance, and as you have put into one scale the burthen of friendship, let me put its comforts into the other. For assuredly, nobody will care for him who cares for nobody. But friendship is precious, not only in the shade, but in the sunshine of life. And thanks to a benevolent arrangement of things, the greater part of life is sunshine. Thomas Jefferson.
Back home, the Virginia legislature enacts Jefferson's Statute of Religious Freedom, providing for the separation of church and state. And in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention meets. One of the most heated debates at the convention is over slavery, although the word slavery never appears in the final document. One compromise reached is that the federal government cannot prevent the importation of new slaves into America for 20 years. And at the insistence of the southern states, a slave now counts as 3/5 of a person in determining a state's representation to Congress and votes in the Electoral College. Those added electoral votes will one day help Jefferson's election as president.
While Jefferson is in France, he sees the borrowing and squandering that results in the financial collapse of the country. It helps to crystallize what becomes for him a fundamental principle of government and private life. No generation can pass its problems or its debts on to the next generation. For Jefferson, that is generational tyranny. From Paris, he writes to his friend James Madison. He uses a term from Roman law, usufruct, meaning something given in trust, and writes, because the earth belongs in usufruct to the living to make use of, no generation can contract debts greater than may be paid during the course of its own existence.
The whole idea of self-government is based on being free to act. People in debt are not free to act. And writing in 1789 in that famous letter of September 6 to James Madison, Jefferson most fully develops this great theme of his political philosophy, and that is that every generation is like an independent nation, should be free and equal with respect to every other generation. It's as if you imagine a generation is the living generation is a country unto itself, and that it should be free of and independent of the burdens passed on by predecessors, and it should pass on the legacy of freedom and self-government to the next generation by not encumbering it with enormous debts. So Jefferson's concern with debts becomes not just a personal issue and a lifelong problem that he deals with, but is also a central premise of his political philosophy.
For Jefferson, the principle of the living generation extends beyond the issue of debt. It applies to land use, resource allocation, anything that should be passed on to the next generation. And for Jefferson, a term like generation could not be left vague. He uses tables compiled by Buffon and calculates a generation to be 19 years. That is how long, he says, debts should be contracted for, how long patents and copyrights should extend. And he even proposes that every 19 years, the U.S. Constitution should be re-examined. To many, this is far-fetched. To Jefferson, the key point is that each generation has the right to determine its own destiny.
In the fall of 1789, Jefferson returns to America, filled with new ideas about government, new designs for Monticello, and a commission from President George Washington to become America's first Secretary of State. He also ships home 86 crates of French furniture and fine art. During Jefferson's term as Secretary of State, a rebellion breaks out in the Caribbean.
Haiti, which at that time was a colony of France called Saint-Domingue, was in fact, at the time of the French Revolution, the richest, the most prosperous, the most productive of all of the slave colonies in the Americas. In fact, half of the world's sugar and coffee was produced on this one-third of an island in the Caribbean. There's a massive slave rebellion, which then leads through a series of successive stages toward independence for Haiti, which was declared on January 1st, 1804. The Haitian Revolution is really very much a part of Thomas Jefferson's world, and we also know that Jefferson had a special interest partly because he was such a devotee of the French Revolution and of France. There's a lot of contrast. The main one really being that in the Haitian case, you have a new polity that's built on the fundamental principle of the abolition of slavery. I mean, that's really what pushed this rebellion forward.
Haiti is a dilemma for Jefferson and the new nation. During the American Revolution, Haitian soldiers fought for the colonies in their struggle for independence. But now in Haiti, this is a revolution of slaves. The slaves are rebelling against their white masters, masters who support French rule, and France is a powerful ally of the United States.
But Haiti also speaks directly to one of Jefferson's greatest fears, a violent uprising of slaves in America. Unless something is done, he warns, we will be the murderers of our own children. On Haiti, Jefferson remains neutral. A struggle lasting more than a decade results in Haiti becoming the second independent nation in the hemisphere.
If you imagine living in Virginia, there are any number of things that could make even a relatively large slaveholder think twice about the future of slavery. First of all, you have these ideas associated with the Revolution and of universal human freedom, the ideas that are being expounded in France and England. But there's more than this. There are things that are much more immediate, much grittier, which is the fact that your plantation doesn't seem to be nearly as profitable as it might be. When you travel to Pennsylvania or New Jersey, you see the productive farms there, you wonder, how productive could Virginia be if we had free labor instead of slave labor? So you can find people who are not just sort of bitten with the infection of Enlightenment ideas who could believe that as a very hard-headed sort of business proposition, a question of political economy, that having slavery in gradually might not be all that bad.
Like Jefferson, George Washington inherits most of his slaves through marriage. But during his life, Washington refuses to buy or sell his slaves. He also leaves instructions in his will that all the slaves be freed upon the death of his wife, Martha. Early in his life, Benjamin Franklin owned a small number of slaves. But in his last years, he becomes president of the Pennsylvania abolitionist movement. Shortly before his death, he writes Congress, asking them to loosen the bands of slavery, that all may enjoy the birthright of liberty. And Jefferson's daughter Martha writes about her distress over the ownership of slaves.
Good God, have we not enough? I wish with all my soul that the poor Negroes were all freed. It grieves my heart when I think that these, our fellow creatures, should be treated so terribly as they are by many of our countrymen.
Over the course of his lifetime, Jefferson owns some 400 slaves. He engages in the commerce of slavery, buying and selling them as a source of ready capital, or to keep slave families together. During his life, he frees only 3.
A good cause is often injured more by ill-timed efforts of its friends than by the arguments of its enemies. Persuasion, perseverance, and patience are the best advocates on questions depending on the will of others. The revolution in public opinion which this cause requires is not to be expected in a day, or perhaps in an age, but time, which outlives all things, will outlive this evil also. Thomas Jefferson.
When Jefferson was actually here on a regular basis, things seemed to have gone quite well on the plantation. And when he would go back into public service, all kinds of trouble broke out. I think in general that his absence had a definite effect on how things operated here on the plantation and the whole financial health of that operation. Jefferson's own family, in fact, blamed his constant absences in public service for the state of his finances.
While he is away, Jefferson's daughter Martha, now the wife of Thomas Mann Randolph, keeps her father informed about the difficulties at home.
My dearest father, we are burnt up for want of rain. The drought has continued for upwards of 5 weeks, and there is no appearance of its discontinuing as yet. People are in great pain about their crops. Indeed, they have a wretched prospect before them, as many of them are suffering for bread, even at this time. Martha Jefferson Randolph.
In 1793, Thomas Jefferson resigns as Secretary of State. At the age of 50, he returns home, where crowds, including many of his own slaves, welcome him.
Mr. Jefferson was very liberal and kind to the poor. When he would come from Washington, the poor people all about the country would find it out immediately and would come in crowds to Monticello to beg him. He told me that when they came to him and told him their pitiful tales, he could not refuse them, and he did not know what to do. I told him to send them to me. He did so, but they would never come. They knew what to expect. Edmund Bacon.
For the next few years, Jefferson turns his attention to the plantation and its growing debt. But it proves a short retirement, for in 1796, his political party, the Republicans, run against the Federalists, led by Jefferson's old friend, John Adams. The Federalists win by 3 electoral votes, and Adams becomes the nation's second president. For coming in second, Jefferson becomes vice president. But in 1800, Jefferson and Adams face each other again. Jefferson writes, "I like everything about Adams, except his politics." Now the two men, who were so aligned at the Declaration of Independence, disagree over the direction of the new nation. Adams supports a strong central government. Jefferson, a more limited states' rights government. The campaign is cruel, and the attacks personal. Jefferson is labeled an infidel by the Federalists, in part for his position on the separation of church and state. The Republicans label Adams a monarchist. Slavery is not a major issue. The election is so close, it takes 36 ballots in the House of Representatives to decide. But in the end, Thomas Jefferson becomes 3rd President of the United States. Adams, weary of political life and embittered by the campaign, retires to Massachusetts. Jefferson is under attack from the start of his presidency. But in September 1802, Jefferson finds himself facing accusations of a very different kind. The Richmond Recorder publishes a story alleging a relationship between Jefferson and a Monticello slave, Sally Hemings.
It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor keeps and for many years past has kept as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking, although sable resemblance to those of the president himself. The African Venus is said to officiate as housekeeper at Monticello. James T. Callender.
In the 1790s, the Scottish-born James Callender wrote against the Federalists, including stories about Alexander Hamilton and his affair with a married woman. After Jefferson is elected president, Callender expects to be rewarded with a political appointment, but Jefferson decides otherwise. Callender is angered by the rejection and now begins writing for the Federalists. One of his first stories is about Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
This was the scandal of the day, and in very short order, all of the Federalist press had picked up Callender's story and was serializing it, all the way up to Boston.
All the damsels on the green, on mountain or in valley, a lass so luscious ne'er was seen as Monticello Sally. Yankee Doodle, who's the doodle? What wife perhaps so handy to breed a flock of slaves for stock of blackamoors the dandy?
What Callender's contribution, if you would want to call it that, is to say publicly and in print, there's really no difference between public virtue and private virtue, that if a man is a hypocrite and a person who engages in miscegenation, a person who exploits his slaves, a person who has illicit sexual relationships, then that has a direct bearing upon his capacity to be a leader for his nation.
What makes the accusation so damning for Jefferson is that throughout his life, he has condemned miscegenation, the mixing of the races. Jefferson writes, "Amalgamation of blacks and whites produces a degradation to which no lover of his country, no lover of excellence in the human character, can innocently consent." He feels so strongly that he develops an elaborate mathematical formula for when the descendants of mixed blood can return to full white.
2 crosses with the pure white and a third with any degree of mixture, however small, clears the issue of Negro blood. Thomas Jefferson.
Yet, as painful as the accusations about Sally Hemings are, Jefferson's defense is to say nothing.
And in fact, his silence in a way fueled the newspaper stories, because by not saying anything, the opposition press could say, well, we're still waiting. And Jefferson resolutely refused to deny. So the story continued and continued.
What is held as fact by some, an impossibility by others, is that while in France, Jefferson fathered a boy named Tom by Sally Hemings. At the time, Jefferson would have been 44, and Sally Hemings 14.
The tradition in the accounts that we have discovered through research is that Thomas Woodson, at that time just called Tom, was conceived in Paris because Sally Hemings was there with Jefferson after she had helped transport his youngest daughter, living daughter, to him back in about 1788, 1787, 1788. And while there, she was given clothing, being educated, learned French, and most likely became his concubine. When she returned to the United States, shortly after, Thomas Woodson was born in 1790.
According to the account handed down in the Woodson family, Jefferson bends to pressure from the press, and in 1802, when the boy is 12, sends him to a nearby plantation. He takes the name of the plantation owner and becomes Thomas Woodson. There is almost no written history about this. Most slaves and slave descendants could not read or write, so many who trust the story rely on oral tradition.
In the Woodson family, we have all of these people who have answered the question, when did you first hear about the Sally Heming, Thomas Jefferson relationship? And they come up with stories which are pretty close to being identical. And these are among people who, for 4 generations, did not contact one another. This story runs through 4 different families in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Tennessee, and Texas. So that sort of thing leads me to believe that it happened.
Jefferson keeps lists of the children of his slaves in his farm book. Here, he lists no child named Tom under Sally Hemings's name. He does list a Tom with no last name, whom the Woodson family believed to be Thomas Woodson. Others claim him to be an itinerant farm worker. But Jefferson does record Sally having at least 5 other children: Beverly, Harriet, who died in infancy, a second Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Most believe that all of Sally's children were fathered by a white man.
Now, all of the children were able to be Thomas Jefferson's children according to the times when he was at Monticello. We know that he was president and was away in Washington quite often. But 9 to 10 months before each one of them was born, he was present at Monticello, and Sally Heming was present in Monticello. And the ability to father those children was there. No one contends that point. No one contends the point that he was there.
Isaac Jefferson, a slave at Monticello, leaves in his memoirs a description of Sally Hemings.
Sally, mighty near white. She was the youngest child. Folks said these Hemings was old Mr. Wales' children. Sally was very handsome, long, straight hair down her back.
As best we know, and this comes through oral tradition that no one really has disputed much, Sally Hemings herself was 3/4 white. She was the daughter of Betty Hemings, a mulatto that is half black, half white slave woman, and John Wales, who happened to be Jefferson's father-in-law. Betty Hemings, Sally's mother, was John Wales' slave. After the death of his wife, he apparently took Betty Hemings as his slave mistress, fathering some children, one of whom was Sally. What this means also is that Sally Hemings would have been Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha's half-sister. She might well have resembled Martha Jefferson. She might have reminded Jefferson of his deceased wife.
In 1873, an article appears in an Ohio newspaper, dictated by Sally's son, Madison Hemings. Madison identifies Thomas Jefferson as his father and describes in detail life at Monticello. Madison also tells how his mother's duties were to care for Jefferson's chambers and wardrobe. But recently, a first-of-its-kind DNA study was undertaken with the descendants of Jefferson and Sally Hemings. While not totally fail-safe, it presented clear evidence to show no genetic link between Jefferson and Thomas Woodson. But it did show a link between Jefferson and Sally's youngest son, Eston. Jefferson was present at Monticello at the time Sally conceived all her children, leading many to conclude Jefferson is most likely the father. While some contest the DNA results, others are rethinking this chapter of the Jefferson legacy.
Jefferson's greatest defenders among the historical profession have thought that Jefferson was a man of impeccable character, a man who hated slavery, a man who was uncomfortable with women and would have been uncomfortable with the very idea of an extramarital or a non-marital relationship with a woman. And given those considerations, it would seem impossible to them that Jefferson would have engaged in a dalliance or an affair or even a long-term loving relationship with a woman who was his slave. Beginning in the late 60s and the early 70s, first with Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black, then with Fawn Brody's very famous biography, Thomas Jefferson Intimate Biography, other historians began to look at the Sally Hemings story, re-examine the Sally Hemings legend, and to say, well, it's not necessarily implausible. Some argue that to say that he was capable of a loving relationship with a slave woman humanizes him. Other people who dislike Jefferson will say he's a hypocrite, and therefore all Americans are hypocritical. American democracy is in some fundamental way hypocritical. Jefferson, the way that you treat Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that story then becomes sort of a symbol of what you think the legacy of slavery and American race relations is.
One of the great achievements of Jefferson's first term as president is the Louisiana Purchase. It is a vast region extending from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. For $15 million, roughly 3 cents an acre, it nearly doubles the size of the new nation. Jefferson sends his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, along with William Clark, to explore the territories. Years before, Jefferson trained Lewis as a surveyor. Now Jefferson gives the two detailed instructions to record every great natural site and to greet the Native Americans in peace. Jefferson says, offer their children the opportunity to be educated by us if they so desire. In 1804, Jefferson easily wins re-election. During his second term, the Constitution's 20-year moratorium on the importation of slaves ends, and Jefferson signs the ban into law. But during Jefferson's second term, tensions with England and France are growing. There is piracy at sea, and instead of war, Jefferson begins a trade embargo. It has mixed success, causing as much harm to America as its enemies. The Federalists again find Jefferson an easy target. As Jefferson's second term draws to a close, his desire to return to Monticello grows even stronger. Back on the mountain, he can enjoy again the life of a country farmer, but his years in public service have been costly.
My dear Papa, the impossibility of paying serious debts by crops and living at the same time has been so often proved that I am afraid you should trust to it. If by any sacrifice you can relieve yourself from the pressure of debt, I conjure you not to think of the children. Your happiness is alone to be considered. Let not the tranquility of your old age be disturbed, and we shall do well. I never could enjoy happiness to see you deprived of those comforts you have always been accustomed to, and which habit has rendered necessary to your health and ease. Martha Jefferson Randolph.
When I look to the ineffable pleasures of my family society, I become more and more disgusted with the jealousies, the hatred, and the rancorous and malignant passions of the scene, and lament my having ever again been drawn into public view. Tranquility is now my object. Thomas Jefferson.
When Jefferson took office in 1801, the young nation was already $83 million in debt. As he leaves office after 2 terms of frugal government and growing commerce, the debt is cut by almost a third. As president, Jefferson received a rather healthy annual salary of $25,000, but the salary did not include an allowance for the social obligations of a president. And with Jefferson's passion for the finest in everything, he leaves office $10,000 more in debt than when he began. He says it is comforting to know he did not profit from his years in service to the country.
In 1809, a weary Jefferson returns to Monticello. He is nearly 66. Over time, he turns from politics, stops reading newspapers, and even purchases advertisements telling people not to write him because he has neither the interest nor the energy to reply.
The man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors. Thomas Jefferson.
In the last few years, I think he is like Epicurus. He is deciding that you can't battle the world and all these problems, and he does become more tranquil and simply accept things and let them take their course. There's a little bit of fatalism in Jefferson at times. The old man burdened down with enormous problems, deeply in debt and no way out.
In his later years, Jefferson's greatest joy comes from his 12 grandchildren, who fill Monticello. They are his escape from the infirmities of arthritis and migraine headaches. Yet, even in retirement, Jefferson embarks on what he believes is one of his most important projects, the creation of the University of Virginia. Jefferson designs the campus, develops the curriculum, and selects many of the professors, all with the intention, he says, of preparing leaders for a new nation. Yet the next generation of statesmen is already shaping the future of slavery, including a young admirer of Jefferson's, Edward Coles.
Coles writes to Jefferson and basically says, I'm going to free my slaves, and I'm going to free my slaves because I've read Jefferson, because I've been persuaded by the Jeffersonian ideas that slavery is wrong. And he basically is asking Thomas Jefferson, this is 1814, Jefferson is an old man, he's basically asking this former president for his blessings.
Jefferson responds to Coles.
My opinion has ever been that until more can be done for them, we should endeavor, with those whom fortune has thrown on our hands, to feed and clothe them well, protect them from ill usage, require such reasonable labor only as is performed voluntarily by freemen, and be led by no repugnance to abdicate them and our duties to them.
Jefferson reminds Coles that as a young member of the House of Burgesses, he and Richard Bland attempted to ease the Virginia slave laws and were called traitors. But so much has happened since that day 45 years earlier. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence has become the foundation for a new nation based on equality. The northern states have abandoned slavery altogether, while the southern states, with the invention of the cotton gin, find the once marginal institution now even more entrenched. And Jefferson, who spoke so strongly against generational tyranny, against passing the problems and the debts of one generation to the next, now seems resigned to doing just that when it comes to slavery and his own personal debt.
This enterprise is for the young, for those who can follow it up and bear it through to its consummation. It shall have all my prayers, and these are the only weapons of an old man. Thomas Jefferson.
Coles fortunately ignores Jefferson, takes his slaves to Illinois, frees them, and then later becomes governor of Illinois, and helps prevent Illinois from becoming a slave state. So the legacy of Jefferson is there, even if Jefferson isn't part of his own legacy, even if he's not part of his own movement.
Yet some of Jefferson's most potent words on slavery come near the end of his long life. In 1820, Congress admits Missouri into the Union as a slave state, and a line is drawn at the 3630 parallel, above which slavery is prohibited, below which it is accepted. It is the Missouri Compromise. For Jefferson, it is the beginning of the end of the new nation.
I have been among the most sanguine in believing that our union should be of long duration. I now doubt it much, and see the event at not great distance, and the direct consequence of this question. This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other. I regret that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, and that my only consolation is to be, that I live not to weep over it.
In the spring of 1826, as the division over slavery grows ever deeper, the country prepares a special celebration for the 50th anniversary of its founding document, the Declaration of Independence. Of the original signers, only Jefferson, John Adams, and Charles Carroll are still alive. Jefferson, 83 and in failing health, declines the invitation to attend.
I should indeed, with peculiar delight, have met and exchanged there congratulations personally with the small band, the remnant of that host of worthies, who joined with us on that day in the bold and doubtful election we were to make for our country, between submission or the sword, and to have enjoyed with them the consolatory fact that our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. Thomas Jefferson.
In the early afternoon of July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson dies. Incredibly, that same day in Massachusetts, John Adams also dies. The last words Adams speaks are, "Thomas Jefferson still survives."
Jefferson left debts of over $100,000 at his death, and all of his property, the house, the lands, and the slaves, had to be sold to help pay these debts. So this economic catastrophe really swept away all the families of Monticello, both black and white. Jefferson's will bequeathed freedom to 5 of his slaves: John Hemmings, the cabinet maker, his nephews Madison and Eston Hemmings, who were his apprentices, really, Joe Fawcett, the blacksmith, and Burl Colbert, who was butler. But 130 slaves were sold at auction after Jefferson's death because of the great indebtedness of his estate.
All 5 slaves freed in Jefferson's will are either children or grandchildren of Betty Hemmings. He does not free Sally Hemings. She is freed 2 years later by Jefferson's daughter Martha and dies in 1835 at the age of 62. The great dilemma of Jefferson's own life is that he recognized the injustice of slavery, but was unable to change it. Within little more than a generation after his death, his prediction about the end of the Union nearly comes true. Yet Jefferson will forever be part of our American conscience for the declaration he wrote, for the eloquence that defines the spirit and dreams of a nation, for the words that empowered his generation and every generation since to make real those truths we hold to be self-evident.